Right, good morning. The sun's just disappearing there again. Got my glasses on just for that. Anyway, this is episode 2 of the Perspective podcast, the show where everything's made up and the points don't matter. What's the purpose of this little podcast? I said to you in the first episode is just to share things that I do that work for me, and maybe they could work for you. It's really that simple. It's nothing more groundbreaking than that. And so on the second one, the question that's come up for me is something from a personal experience, interaction with somebody I know. And I don't think this is uncommon, and it's also something I feel as well. And the question is, why do I feel disconnected, or unanchored, or not present? And I think that question is really quite valuable in today's context, because it's something that I think many people would feel fairly frequently, not unlike that question around despair, which I spoke about in the first episode. So here's a bit of background for you. I'm going to talk about the true self and the false self. A quick disclaimer, I'm not a psychologist, otherwise I'd be charging for these videos. But the point is, I understand quite a bit about psychology and have much interest in it, and some studies in it as well. And so the idea of true self and false self is also kind of boiled down to what they call faking good and faking bad, in the psychological sense. And this original concept comes, I believe, from a guy called Donald Winnicott back in the mid 1800s. And he was essentially discovered that we tend to, as part of our development and socialization, we tend to basically disconnect from the true self, because the true self really is that when you're an absolute child or a baby, when you're in that state, generally you'll find that your needs and desires are much more easily met, and so you're more in touch with your true self. And as you socialized and get older, or grow through that development period of 7 years, then you are able to integrate the true self with the false self, because the false self is essentially what comes through socialization, where the child begins to essentially realize its boundaries and the reality, its reality. This is normal, happens to everyone. Welcome to the club. But I think the key point here is, if you're not aware of that and you're sitting at a certain age in life on from that, you kind of might sometimes feel that disconnection because you really have not managed to integrate the true self with the false self. Because the false self, you can't replace the true self with the false self. I mean, if we went around sort of following our exact desires and needs, they might conflict with others. And I guess that's why we have sort of societal norms and authority and those sorts of things. And if you think about it in a way, that period of the 7 years when you're growing up, in essence, is when you learn to comply with authority, the authority of your parents, essentially. Now, that's not a good or a bad thing, but depending on the disconnect between those two, the true and the false self, you'll find that if that gap's really quite wide, and you haven't managed to even grapple with the true self, however good, bad, or ugly that is, you may find yourself feeling quite disconnected, because you are kind of not living true to yourself in some regards, in terms of what's inside of you and what your needs and desires are. And I think especially in today's times, we would tend to say and do things that we don't really believe. And that in itself is also leading to that false self concept, because it's kind of like complying with the consensus, with authority, and all of those sorts of things, which, by the way, I'm not saying are bad. I think that's a balance that we need in society. But at the same time, if that's out of balance and a lot of things don't make sense, which I think it is for a lot of people, even those that believe they have all of the answers, it is something you can't really hide from because it surfaces. And I think part of the reason we're here is really to discover our true selves. It's part of the journey. So what can you do practically about this? I have the thoughts of the following. The first is to understand that it's not just you that has this disconnection. A lot of the people that you interact with that appear to be very together actually have this disconnection, but they're unconscious to it in many instances. I mean, everyone has it. We all have a true and false self. But I think for some people to suppress the true self or deny sort of information that comes through is a good way to, it's a survival mechanism. And so they might seem as happy as Larry, but really on the inside they're struggling. So the first point is to be aware that this is a normal and common phenomenon, and to be compassionate with others, realizing that they're probably experiencing much the same as you are. It's just the level of awareness that might differ. And so if you can bring that into the awareness, you can then start to feel more in balance. So the one thing that I did, which is seems kind of corny, but it does actually work for me, is it's I think what they call inner child work, and it sounds extremely sort of hip and all the rest of it, but it's not really what it is. It's something very simple and practical. And so this is what I did. Basically, find a childhood photo of yours. Any time up to the age of 7, let's say. Maybe a time that you were happy as well. Probably helps. And take that photo and put it on your mobile phone. If you have a mobile phone, put it on the mobile phone on the screensaver. So it's like literally on the phone all the time, whenever you look at the phone. And when you look at that child, realize that you are not that child anymore, but that child is still within you. And in fact, that child was probably the most authentic version of you at some point. And there's two things you can do. You can try to remember who that child was and try to reintegrate those, I wouldn't say behaviors, maybe that's part of it, but those needs and desires that that child had, and the type of personality that the child had, because it's still there. And it might seem kind of strange and opaque to people around you that you seem to be changing, but in essence what you're doing is you're just going back to who you were. And realize once that, the false self is also not a bad thing. We all have to be false to some extent in society to socialize. But if you have a good understanding of who you are in the true sense, it's easier for you to accommodate the false self because you're not at odds with yourself. I know that sounds really strange, but I'll go with that. And the second thing is when you look at the child in the photo is, just to have some compassion for that child, to realize, that the child went through a process of socialization. You have certain views, feelings, intuitions today about that child, and think to the idea that, the average child, I think, hears the word no 15,000 times before they're like 3 years old. And so you would have been, I suppose, socialized, disciplined, or whatever the case may be. And so as part of that process, going from this blank slate to being the child with the formed personality at the age of 7, in essence, you would have experienced a lot of that socialization and compliance, and that's normal. And so it's a good time to start thinking back to that and realize that it's just a part of growing up. And that child would have had many feelings about things, and you can now, on behalf of that child, let those feelings go, and yeah, forgive yourself for that. Let go of any feelings of shame or guilt, not in the bad sense, but these things in essence come around through the process of socialization. You shouldn't do that, you should do that, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, we're just human beings, right? So that's all I got for you today. I will make a third video because it's actually sunny now.